I'd like to welcome you to be here for Promoting a Respectful Workplace, a training and policy on preventing discrimination and harassment. This is presented on behalf of the Legislative Council, who has worked on a policy over the last interim. It's also, the policy is being reflected in the joint rules, and that's coming through Senate Joint Rules, or Senate Rules Committee tomorrow, and so you will see it eventually on the respective floors. There's sign-up sheets that we have. They're on clipboards, and they'll be going down each side. So make sure you sign up, and you'll get a certificate that says that you attended this training. I'd like to present to you our trainer for today. Her name's Amy Christensen, and she's of the Christensen and Prizeau law firm here in Helena. And so here she is. No, oh, just give me 2 seconds.
Thank you. All good? Okay. Can you hear me okay? So as Susan said, my name is Amy Christensen. I'm in private practice here in Helena. I've been practicing for about 20 years. I work mostly in employment law. And as part of that, I have an opportunity to work with employers on meeting their obligations under state and federal discrimination and harassment law. So I do a lot of advising on the issues. I do training as well. So today we're going to talk about some discrimination and harassment issues. And we're also going to have a conversation about the new policy. So I'll explain kind of what the procedures are that are in it, kind of what it prohibits, what it doesn't prohibit. And I'll talk probably for about an hour and then leave some time for questions at the end so everybody can get to wherever they need to go next. So some folks may be wondering why we're having this conversation. They may not have experienced discrimination or harassment themselves. They may not have observed it happening with other people. But the reality is it happens in all kinds of workplaces, big and small, public and private. So for example, we know that it's happened in Hollywood, in the entertainment industry. This quote is from about a year ago, and at that point there were 100 men accused of sexual misconduct. I believe that number is higher by now. We also know that discrimination and harassment happens at the highest levels of government in Congress. Again, a number of months ago, and we had 9 members of Congress who lost their job over sexual harassment in 6 months. We also know that sexual harassment and other kinds of harassment and discrimination also happen in state legislatures. Sorry, the font is so small on these slides. I had to fit in all of those states where the allegations have been made. And that was information from August of last year, that there were impacts in all of those states from discrimination and harassment allegations. And as a result of that, members of state legislatures were expelled, resigned, had committee or leadership positions revoked, or they otherwise were affected since 2017. In Arizona in particular, about a year ago, Representative Don Shooter was accused of misconduct by a colleague, another legislator, as well as a number of other women. The charges were investigated and substantiated, and the matter came to the floor of the House of Representatives in Arizona, and as a result of that, he had an opportunity to defend himself. At the conclusion, he did a fancy mic drop, and then the House voted, I think it was 57-3, to expel him. So a year ago, that's what happened in Arizona. So we know it happens in lots of different kinds of workplaces. So the good news is the Montana legislature is looking at a new policy to address allegations of discrimination and harassment. The new policy has a lot of similarities to the rule that's already in place that prohibits discrimination and harassment. But the real difference and the real change that's coming through this particular policy is that it includes a process, and it's a process that is available to everyone. So people who have experienced or observed harassment or discrimination, they have multiple avenues to report it. Previously, there wasn't a real clear way to do it. Now people can report it. And it isn't just legislators who can report it. It's anybody who comes into contact with the legislative process. So that would include lobbyists, it would include the press, it would include members of the public, and it would include legislative staff permanent, temporary, seasonal, pages, interns, all of those folks now have a process through which they can report discrimination or harassment. It's also important that this new policy has a way for people to respond if there is an allegation about harassment or discrimination that is filed against them. And that isn't always the case in all sorts of workplaces. This is a real positive change for this legislature. So if someone is on the receiving end of an allegation of harassment or discrimination, there's a process involved, and I'll walk through that in a little bit more detail. The policy that I'm going to talk about today is really one of several that are being implemented simultaneously. There are a number of different policies because what happens is a little bit different depending on who is accused of harassment. So if it's a legislator who's accused, there's certain things that can and can't happen to them in the event the charge is substantiated. Like they can't be fired, like an employee could be fired. So legislators have their own policy. There are also other policies for other people who are involved in the legislative process. So like an employee, again, they have another policy because the process and the consequences of engaging in offending behavior are different. A legislative staffer could be fired, right? Press, again, something different. They're not employees. A lobbyist. So there's different consequences that happen, so different policies. We're going to focus on the policy that affects legislators who are accused of harassment or discrimination. Okay, so the policy itself prohibits discrimination and harassment based on protected characteristics, which is really key. In the Montana Human Rights Act, there's a whole list of protected classes, and they're included here. They're mirrored in federal law with the exception of marital status, which is unique in Montana. There's different kinds of discrimination that people talk about. One is generic discrimination, and this is kind of the, I don't know, more lay understanding of what it is. It may be interpersonal conflicts. It may be a disagreement with a supervisor. It might be gossiping or rumors. People experience this kind of stuff in the workplace, and their reaction might be, oh, I feel like I'm being discriminated against. I'm being subject to a hostile work environment because my boss is micromanaging me. Well, that is not discrimination based on membership in a protected class. That's a generic kind of discrimination, which isn't covered by this policy. The policy covers protected class discrimination, and if the discrimination or harassment is based on protected class, it will violate the policy, may also be unlawful under state and federal law. So let's talk about harassment. Harassment is a subset of discrimination. It's a type of discrimination, falls under that umbrella, and it isn't limited to sexual harassment. Neither the policy nor state or federal law limit harassment just to conduct based on sex. It includes harassment based on membership in any protected class. So it could be disability, it could be religion, race, any of the other classes that are protected in the policy and in the law. The legislature prohibits discrimination and harassment based on all of those protected classes. So it's a pretty broad scope. It's really not narrow. Sexual harassment is the most common, but it isn't exclusive. So there's different types of harassment itself. Quid pro quo, which means this for that, and hostile work environment. And I'm going to talk about the differences between those two. But the one thing that is common to both of them is that the conduct is unwelcome to the recipient. So what is quid pro quo harassment? That's harassment when the submission to whatever's being demanded is a term or condition of employment, or in the case of the legislature, it would be a term or condition of rank, committee assignment, that sort of thing. Quid pro quo harassment is also a situation where submission or rejection of whatever's being requested is the basis for an employment decision, or decision, again, based on rank, committee assignment, that sort of thing. So an example of quid pro quo harassment would be something like, hey, I understand that you're interested in this particular committee assignment. How about we go out for a drink tonight and have a conversation about it? I'm sure it'll go much better if we do this outside the Capitol and it's just the two of us. That sort of thing kind of sets up a quid pro quo harassment claim. So again, a lot of times a quid pro quo harassment situation will involve outside of the legislature, it's called a tangible employment action, but again, it would be something like something that affects kind of more, I don't know, a status potentially at the legislature, such as a committee assignment. In another employment situation, it would involve something at the level of a hiring, firing, failure to promote, that sort of thing, or a reassignment. Hostile work environment harassment is a different kind of harassment. It's very different from quid pro quo, but again, it has to be based on membership in a protected class. Like I said before, you may hear people saying, oh, I feel like I'm being subject to a hostile work environment. That's just the small h hostile work environment. We're talking about the big H hostile work environment, which is based on membership in a protected class. It's when the conduct is directed at someone because they are a woman, because they're of a minority race, because of, they have a disability, any one of those protected classes. And under a hostile work environment situation, the conduct that is occurring has to unreasonably interfere with a person's work performance or create an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So that's where the phrase hostile work environment comes from. So the standard under the law to be unlawful as a hostile work environment is the conduct has to be so severe or pervasive that it alters the terms and conditions of employment, which is a pretty high standard. And there's a lot of behavior below that standard that goes on that may not reach that threshold of being severe and pervasive. But the policy that the legislature is considering, it prohibits inappropriate conduct based on protected class. So the unlawful standard is up here. The policy is going to prohibit all that other behavior, even if it doesn't rise to the level of being severe or pervasive. So again, it's very, very broad. It will hit that unacceptable conduct even if it's not rising to the level of being unlawful. So I have some questions for you to try to make this a little bit more real life, like we're talking conceptually, but what it comes down to is, how do we apply this in our everyday lives? What are the practical takeaways here? So question number one, true or false? If you tell a story with a sexual connotation to someone else, it's okay if the storyteller doesn't intend to offend any listeners. So you might have someone of one gender telling someone of the same gender a sexually explicit joke, and it's supposed to be funny. The teller's like, oh, I'm just kidding around. Is it okay? Is that okay? It's not. It's not going to be okay. Because the harassment under the policy is going to prohibit sexual jokes. It's going to prohibit any kind of name-calling, negative stereotyping, denigrating jokes that are based on someone's protected class. And there aren't any exceptions if you're telling someone a joke about sex, but you're telling it to somebody of the same gender. No exception there. Same thing for race. It doesn't matter if the teller and the recipient are of the same race. There's no exception for those kinds of things. It's also important to note that the harasser's intent isn't relevant. And this is something that comes up a lot in sexual harassment claims. You have someone who says, I didn't mean to offend her. I was just joking around. She's just really sensitive, and she just didn't get it. And if I offended her, I'm really sorry. That line of defense is totally ineffective. The person who is telling the joke or engaging in the harassing behavior, their intent in engaging in that behavior doesn't matter. The conduct is evaluated from the recipient's perspective. So it matters who is on the receiving end and how they feel about what is going on. And that is judged by a reasonable person standard, which is a term of art under the law. I think it makes a lot of lay people chuckle because it's like, what is a reasonable person? It is an objective standard, which means you might have somebody who's especially sensitive. If it offends them, Maybe that's harassment, maybe it isn't. Would it offend a reasonable person? Okay, second question for you. The legislature's policy is so narrow that an individual can't even tell another person that they look nice that day without implicating the sexual harassment policy and having it be deemed as harassment. True or false? That's false. The policy is not going to prohibit expressions of kindness or concern towards other people. A lot of what goes on in this building is based on relationships, and that's personal. I mean, you can't take the personal side out of it, and we're also all human. So it's okay to tell somebody else, hey, are you feeling okay? Or hey, you look nice today. All of that is okay. It's a matter of figuring out where those boundaries are and making sure that we're all observing those boundaries so that people who come to do business here, people who work here, people who serve in this building, all feel comfortable doing that and that they can focus on their work and not feeling like they're going to be subject to harassment or discrimination. So the policy is going to prohibit things about, comments about another's person or personal appearance that are sexual in nature. So it's one thing to tell someone, hey, I like your sweater today, it's a nice color on you. That's okay. It's another thing to say, hey, I like how your body looks in that sweater today. That's where the line is. That's where you're going to have a problem. Comments about another person's body, that's going to be prohibited. Leering or suggestive stares, like the focus on someone's chest rather than face level, that's a problem. Unwanted sexual advances, all of those things are going to be prohibited by the policy. So other kinds of conduct that can create a hostile work environment, a consensual relationship that goes bad. The unwelcome conduct in a sexual harassment type of situation, I'm just talking about sexual harassment, the conduct will violate the policy, will be potentially unlawful when it's unwelcome. Sometimes you have a consensual relationship, so you have two people who get together, everything's going fine, and then something doesn't go fine and there's a breakup. One person ends the relationship. It becomes a problem when the other person doesn't want to end it and continues to pursue that other person. Emails, texts, calls, that sort of thing. That can create a hostile work environment. And then there's all sorts of run-of-the-mill types of situations that will create a hostile work environment where probably none of these will be news to you. Making comments about someone's looks or clothes. Propositions. Hey, you want to go out? You want to go out? You want to go out? Where somebody has said no. Back rubs, that seems to be something a lot of men think that women like. Not all women like that, so it may be a problem. Or other unwanted touching. Repeated or inappropriate questions about a personal life. A lot of that is, hey, tell me about this person that you're dating, and I want to know more and more and more, to the point where you really are crossing that line and going outside of the personal boundaries that should be observed. Another issue that happens sometimes is that there are personal items in a workplace, in your workspace, that are offensive to someone else. And again, this is a reasonable person standard, not, it would have to be offensive to a reasonable person. So here's another question for you, true or false? If you give a lobbyist an unsolicited back rub, it isn't sexual harassment when it occurs outside the Capitol. It's funny, some mixed responses out there. That is going to be false. A hostile work environment can be created outside the workplace. And it may be off-duty conduct, but as legislators, it's going to be really hard to be off-duty, especially during these 90 days, but also at a lot of other times, because you're public, you serve a public role. So it's going to be hard to be off-duty. But it's also, it can be created, even if the argument is, yeah, I was off-duty, we were just hanging out. And a lot of off-duty conduct takes place off-site parties, cocktail parties, summer outings. Again, you guys won't be in session then, but there's a lot of relationship building, conversations that go on at golf tournaments, that sort of thing, all off duty, or at conferences. All of these situations can create a hostile work environment under the right circumstances. And it can also occur through texting and social media, which may be in the middle of the night. One of the most common denominators in all of these off-duty settings, anybody guess? Alcohol. Totally common. It happens a lot. It's obvious why. People drink, they get more relaxed, they lose their inhibitions. It's in a much more informal setting. People say things that they wouldn't otherwise say in a much more formal environment. And sometimes those things cross the line, and that's when you run into problems. One of the busiest times for employment lawyers is right after the holidays, because Christmas parties, notoriously settings for sexual harassment. But it's important to know that alcohol is not going to be a defense. You can't say, well, I know that, I had this one situation where I had a client who had an open bar at a place where there was a swimming pool, and there was a lot of stuff going on under the water that I can't talk about in this setting, but it was bad. And the response was, well, everybody was drinking. And it's like, that's not a defense. The behavior that occurred is not going to be acceptable. It's going to violate their policy and potentially the law, even though it's off-duty, even though people have been drinking. So another question for you, true or false? There's no violation of the legislature's policy if a legislator racially harasses a member of the press because they're not an employee of the state. True or false? That's going to be false. So a hostile work environment can be experienced by any of you. It can also be experienced by anybody who's involved in this process. So you've got staff, lobbyists, press, and the public. It can also be perpetrated by any of those people. So any of those people can harass you guys, and you guys can harass them. If any of that occurs, it's going to be a problem under the policy. But because there's all sorts of different groups that are interacting with each other, the problems can arise in any of those options there. So what are your responsibilities under this policy? First of all, refrain. Do not engage in discriminatory or harassing behaviors. It's prohibited under the policy. And I know there's a lot of times where people are like, but I don't know where that line is, and you're giving me these general ideas about what it is, but I'm not sure if I say this is going to be harassment, if I say that is going to be harassment. I'm worried. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. Just the general rule of thumb that your parents probably shared with you, if you have to ask yourself whether or not you should say something, the answer is probably no. Just don't say it. So how do you avoid sexual harassment? Avoid behavior with sexual overtones. Again, complimenting someone's body. There is this line between telling someone that they look nice and complimenting them on their body. I had an investigation that I did in a smaller workplace where it was a man that worked with a lot of women, and almost every one of them shared that this guy would tell them he really liked how they looked in their jeans, which is offensive. It offended every single one of those women, and this guy ended up not continuing to work there. But it wasn't a matter of, hey, you look nice. It's like, hey, I like how your body looks in your clothes. That's crossing the line. Asking a person about their sex life or their relationship with others, that same guy, I think I got most of this list from this one guy because he hit all the marks. He did this a lot. He wanted to know about who these women were dating, kind of what they were doing in their personal lives, to the point where it was just really making people feel uncomfortable. He would ask people for a date after they'd repeatedly said no. And I don't know if folks have seen this in the paper recently, but there was a matter out of Bozeman where someone in the media had engaged in this kind of behavior by text and other social media, repeatedly asking someone to become involved who had said no, and it ended up costing him his job. avoiding sexual humor. So this is true whether it's in person or it's by email. This is something that's affected the judiciary, is forwarding emails that have some kind of sexual overtone, and it doesn't even have to be based on sex. It can be based on race or other protected classes. But those kinds of emails, they're not going to go away, and they'll get discovered and disclosed. So back to your responsibilities under this policy, report. So we started with refrain, this is report. Under the policy, there are multiple avenues for folks to report. So you can report it to the leadership in either chamber, so Senate President, Speaker of the House, majority or minority leaders, majority minority whips, or you can report it to the HR office. Once it's reported, it all gets funneled down to the HR office, and then it's important for them to be involved because they know what's going on across the board. They know people who are making complaints. They know people who are on the receiving end of complaints, and they can track patterns as well as consequences. So, true or false? I should report a racist comment written on the bathroom stall even though I'm not a member of the race that was targeted. True. Good. That one's, I think, obvious. That type of thing that's out there, it needs to be reported so that it can be addressed. If you know that it's out there and you disregard it, it can create a culture of acceptance of that kind of behavior. And I think it's easy enough to be like, wow, that's really awful, but it's not directed at me, and I'm not going to do anything about it. I think we all have a responsibility to act on things like that rather than to ignore them, because it does affect the workplace. It affects the integrity of the institution. It affects how people feel about working in this environment, and it's everybody's responsibility to act on that sort of thing when they observe it. You don't want to be this guy with the camera laughing at what's going on here. You want to be responding in the moment. And so that could take any number of different forms. It could be you're experiencing harassment or discrimination directly to you. It could be telling that other person, hey, knock it off. I don't want to hear it. I don't think it's appropriate, and I don't want to interact with you like that. That's totally okay, and encouraged if you feel comfortable doing that. You should also respond if you're somebody who sees that happening. You might be at a cocktail party and you see someone engaging in that behavior towards a lobbyist. You can say something then too. And you guys have authority to do that based on your position. You're also encouraged to report that conduct through the avenues provided in the policy. First off, I think responding in the moment is awesome, but I would also report it because, again, the stuff is being tracked and observed, and the HR staff can start noticing patterns and seeing if there's a problem with a particular person, regardless of what position they hold. Retaliation. The new legislature policy is also going to prohibit retaliation, and that includes people who report. They bring forward a complaint that they've experienced or observed harassment or discrimination. It also includes witnesses. So I'll talk a little bit about the process, but there may be people who participate in an investigation because they saw something happen. Those people are also protected from retaliation. Pretty much anybody who participates in this process is going to be protected from action taken against them because they participated. So let's talk about the process. So again, this policy is based on a situation where the offender is a legislator. So any of you guys being accused of harassment or discrimination, this is the process that will be followed. One option is to pursue it informally. So someone can talk to the legislative branch HR manager or the chief legal counsel about, I feel this happened to me, or I observed this. I'm really not sure what to do about it. Do you think I should bring a complaint? What are my options? That sort of thing. It can start with that type of conversation. You also have the option of trying to figure out how do I just make it stop? A lot of people, especially in this setting where people might have concerns about coming forward, concerns about, well, what's going to happen to that bill that I really want passed, or what's going to happen to my committee assignment, or people are unsure about what will happen if they tap into this process. And really what they want at the end of the day, they want the behavior to stop. They want to be able to come to work and not be leered at or not have to get texts in the middle of the night or whatever is going on. They just want to be able to do their jobs. So in that situation, there is an option to try to get a commitment from the person to stop without going through a formal process. And that is, you can talk to a member of the legislative conduct panel to see if someone there will have a conversation with the offender. It could be talking to another legislative leader, someone who is one of those folks who I mentioned in leadership who could receive a complaint. You can also talk to the HR manager. Any one of those people can go to the person who's engaging in the conduct and say, you just need to stop. It's got to stop. And hopefully that works. Whether it works or not, you still have the option of going to the formal process. So you can start informal and then go to formal. You can totally skip informal and go directly to formal. It just kind of depends on what's going on and kind of how the person feels about what they need in that situation. So what is the formal process? A complaint is made, can be verbal or in writing. It comes to one of those reporting folks. Then it gets goes through the funnel to the HR manager, and ultimately it gets put in front of the legislative conduct panel. The panel gets together to look at the allegations and the response. The person who's on the receiving end of the complaint will be able to provide a response. The legislative conduct panel gets together and looks at that. There are timeframes in the policy when they have to do that. And when you're in session, it's pretty quick. I think it's 3 days. When you're out of session, it's a little bit longer. But it's relatively quick. The complaint is made, they get together, and they do a preliminary review of what's going on. Just a kind of, it's a kind of a gatekeeper role to suss out, what do we have here? At this point in the process, everything that is submitted is confidential. And that is true until the process is completed, and also true unless there is a substantiated claim. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about the confidentiality provisions in the policy. The legislative conduct panel is staffed by the chief legal counsel and the HR manager, who provide some guidance about the process. So here's what can happen as a result of that preliminary inquiry. There's really 3 things. First, there could be a determination the complaint is frivolous. There's nothing that we need to do. The inquiry could also determine the complaint has some merit, but we can figure out what to do. We don't need an investigation. So that might be a situation where complaint is made. The person on the receiving end's like, yeah, that did happen. I'm sorry, I didn't know it was offensive. I will never do it again, mea culpa. In that situation, you can resolve it without an investigation because there's an allegation, an admission, everybody's on the same page. You can address it and move forward. The third situation that could arise is the complaint has merit and a third-party investigation is needed. That might happen if you've got an allegation or multiple allegations and the person on the receiving end denies it. They're like, I never did that, I don't know this person, I was never alone with them, whatever. They're just going to flat out say this never happened. In that sort of situation, it's very hard for the legislative conduct panel to determine what happened, and so they'll bring in a third party to do a formal investigation. And that would mean conversations with witnesses, the person who is the complainant, the person who's the accused, as well as anybody who might have observed the situation, looking at emails, looking at texts, trying to just gather as much information as possible to find out what happened. Once that investigation is completed, then the results go to the panel. The investigator doesn't make any decisions about here's what needs to happen to this person. It's just here's what I have found occurred in this case. Results go to the panel. Then the panel makes a recommendation to the appropriate body for corrective action. So it could be, the appropriate authority is, is the legislator in the House or in the Senate. That would be the corrective body. I'm sorry, the appropriate authority. The corrective action could be any number of things. It could be training. It could be really anywhere from training all the way up to the possibility of expulsion, but there's a long chain of options in between those two things. The corrective actions are listed in the policy. The people who have experienced harassment or discrimination also have the option of filing with the Human Rights Bureau, our state agency, or with the EEOC, the federal agency, or both simultaneously. Typically, they're filed concurrently. And you don't have to choose whether to file a claim there or access the policy. You can do both. Okay, so confidentiality. How is confidentiality handled? All information about a complaint that's brought forward remains confidential until the final disposition of a claim that is substantiated. Now, so confidentiality is maintained to the greatest extent possible. And what that means is it doesn't get distributed to the press. It doesn't get passed around the Capitol. Once a complaint is made, it's handled by as few people as possible and those people who have a need to know. But there is a process. If it does go to an investigation, you do have to share a little bit of that information with people. You need to be able to ask Joe, hey, Joe, did you see this happen? So, I mean, you're revealing information in that situation, but it's the minimum amount necessary in order to find out what happened. So let's say this goes all the way through and a claim is substantiated, then what happens? What access is allowed? Again, confidentiality is going to be applied here, but in Montana, we have to balance the constitutional right to privacy against the constitutional right to know. And as members of who are engaged in public service, you are people who others will argue they have a right to know about your behavior that occurs here. So the good news is I'm almost done. So in terms of confidentiality, I was saying that there's a lot of people who are involved in this process, if there's an investigation in particular, who have privacy interests from the person who is accused on down to everyone who participates. So if there is a request for confidential information, all of those folks would have notice and an opportunity to speak to the issue about whether or not their information ought to be disclosed. Some people may say, I don't care. I didn't see anything, and I don't care if my name's in a report and ends up in the press. Other people may feel really strongly that their information shouldn't be disclosed. They may have been the person who complained about it. It may be very personal to them, and they don't want those kinds of personal details publicly reported. So in those situations, they can say, no, I'm going to exercise my right to privacy, and I believe it outweighs the public's right to know the information that I've reported. In those situations, their information may be redacted. So if there were a request from the press for, let's say, an investigative report from a third-party investigator, that report would be redacted so that anybody whose privacy right outweighs the public's right to know, their name and information would be redacted. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. You guys have been a great audience, very attentive, and I appreciate the questions. Thank you.